The Sony a7 IV is the new baseline for future Sony cameras. It sets the bare minimum for what they will be capable of going forward. And while this camera may not reach some of the same lofty specs of its competition, it is a very capable hybrid camera for people that want photo and video capabilities with far less compromises than the a7 IV. And more importantly, it has me very excited for what we will hopefully see in an a7S IV and FX3 Mark II. Hey, my name is Matt Johnson, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the a7 IV from the perspective of a wedding/commercial/documentary filmmaker and telling you if you should buy it to film things like that. Also, for the sake of ethics, I want you to know this video is not paid or sponsored by Sony, and while they have loaned me this camera so I can make this review, it will sadly be returning to them very soon. And in addition, if you use a Sony camera, I will link to my Sony autofocus cheat sheet down in the video description. This guide is going to show you the absolute best autofocus settings for your Sony camera for filmmaking, and you can download it totally free at the link in the video description. Now, just like with the a7 IV, the a7 V has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor, but that's really where the similarities end, because not only is the sensor brand new, but pretty much every single feature and capability of the a7 V has been changed and improved in some way. But I want you to remember what I said at the start of this review. The a7 V is now the baseline for all future Sony cameras, meaning that all the specs and features that we're going to talk about for this camera, I fully expect to be on all future Sony cameras as well, and most likely be even better. Most importantly by far though, there is one feature, one upgrade that Sony has made to the a7 V that I've been waiting on for a long time, and that I fully believe has enabled most of the upgrades that we see in this camera, as well as future upgrades that we're going to see in other Sony cameras moving forward. This feature is a newly updated processor, the BIOS XR2, and this is also the first new processor that we've seen from Sony since 2020 when the first BIOS XR was introduced in the a7S III. Since then, pretty much all Sony mirrorless cameras have used the BIOS XR, including the flagship A1 II released in December 2024. The a7 V is the first camera from Sony with this new BIOS XR2 chip. So, what does that mean, Matt? Why should I care? Well, Sony says that the BIOS XR2 is their fastest and most efficient image processor ever. And if you have wanted your camera to be capable of recording at higher frame rates and resolutions, a more powerful processor can help with that. And we are seeing both of these things happen with the a7 V thanks to this new BIOS XR2 processor. And remember, this camera is the baseline, meaning that I highly doubt that Sony is really pushing the processor that hard with this camera. We are seeing the minimum specs that it's capable of pushing, something I want you to keep in mind whenever we talk about things like resolution and bit rates with the a7 V. If Sony plans on using this processor for the next 5 years in all their future cameras, I would bet so much money that we're going to see it pushed a lot harder with far better capabilities in future cameras like an a7S IV and FX3 II. Above all, keep this new BIOS XR2 processor in mind as you watch this review, as it is arguably the most important ingredient that gives us a preview of what's to come in future Sony cameras. Now, let's talk more about the a7 V, starting with the body, which is now very similar to the a7R V. So close that it will use the same battery grip as that camera, but different in that Sony says they have slightly modified the hand grip to make it more comfortable, specifically in the area where your index finger rests. Unfortunately, I do not have an a7R V to compare this to, but let me just say that this camera feels very comfortable to hold, and Sony's ergonomics have continued to improve over the years. Now, speaking of the a7R V, one of its most loved features that I, as well as many others, immediately demanded that Sony put on all future cameras was the articulating screen that was capable of not only flipping out so you can film yourself, but also tilting up and down as well. I absolutely love this screen, and I'm so glad to see it in the a7 V, a camera that's commonly considered more of an entry-level full-frame model for Sony, so I love that it's getting features like this from more premium Sony cameras. Next, for upgrades, let's talk about something that I fully anticipate seeing Sony add to all future cameras after the a7 V as well, and that is that they have finally gotten rid of a very legacy port. Yes, the micro USB port, which most companies had left behind, but Sony had held on to for quite a long time due to accessories being compatible with that port. But I'm happy to tell you that micro USB is now gone, and the camera has not one, but two USB Type-C ports. This is extremely useful. It may have you slightly concerned. It's useful because you can now use one port to charge the camera, or in the other to control it or transfer data at the same time, which is fantastic for versatility and keeping the A7 IV power. But the reason I was concerned was that I am someone who uses and is a big fan of timecode. And if you've used timecode with your Sony camera, you know that if you want to embed the timecode signal into your video file and not have it use one of the audio channels, you need to use a timecode adapter cable that will run into, you guessed it, the micro USB port on your Sony camera. But the A7 V doesn't have that port anymore. So is that a problem? Well, no. At least not with this camera, because Sony never enabled the micro USB port on the A7 IV to work with timecode sync, and it looks like it doesn't work with this camera either. I have purchased a micro USB to USB-C adapter to attempt to test this, but I wasn't able to make it work with timecode, unfortunately. So timecode sync may be a feature that Sony's going to gatekeep behind the more video-focused cameras like the A7S IV and FX3 Mark II, which is definitely a bummer. Anyways, we are almost done covering visible hardware upgrades on this camera, and we're almost ready to dive into and talk about all of the juicy, meaty, technical upgrades inside. But first, I want to draw your attention to these microphone holes at the top of the camera. You can't tell from the outside, but Sony says they've added another mic to this camera. And it's not just for higher quality scratch audio, it's because they wanted to add noise canceling as well. So if you are recording audio in a very loud environment and you want to reduce that noise, you can now enable a setting in the camera to reduce it. And this noise reduction setting works with both the internal mics as well as external mics, which is great to see and hear. Personally, I'm a fan of adding noise reduction in post though, but it's nice to see this feature added to this camera. Sadly though, this appears to be the only audio improvement, as the camera still records audio at a maximum of 24 bits. After Nikon added 32-bit float recording with the ZR, I was really hoping Sony would do the same with A7 V, but there's still a chance Sony could add 32-bit float with an updated XLR K3M adapter, or maybe they're just going to save that for a future A7S IV FX3 II. But still, I really do want to see and hear 32-bit float. Sony will make such a better audio recording experience. Now, are you ready to talk video quality? Yeah, let's talk video quality. Sony says the A7 V is using a brand new partially stacked 33 megapixel sensor, and between its faster performance over that new Bion's XR2 processor in the camera and this new sensor, this camera has significantly improved video features over the A7 IV. Hey, it's Matt from the future, and we're about to talk about the video capabilities of this camera, but I'm recording an extra bit for this review right now because apparently Sony added a setting to the A7 V that I totally missed called 4K angle of view priority. And the way that setting works is that it turns off the in-camera noise reduction, and in addition, it enables the camera to record in full frame 4K at 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, I only learned about this after recording and editing this review, which is why I'm recording this part in the future. And I've already returned the camera to Sony. And whenever I tested the camera, I had this setting turned off, which kept the noise reduction turned on and also resulted in the camera having a very slight crop in 4K 60. Of course, I mentioned this crop throughout the rest of the review because I did not think that there was a way around it, but apparently there is, with the added benefit of having the camera not using noise reduction, which is a setting that a lot of people have been asking for a very long time. So great work in that department, Sony. Unfortunately, I have not otherwise tested this setting, but rest assured, I'm going to try to get this camera back sooner rather than later so I can make a follow-up video about that. The main thing that you need to know is that in the rest of this video, anytime I mention the camera not being capable of recording 4K 60 in full frame, it actually is capable of doing that as long as you enable this 4K angle of view setting and you are okay with giving up noise reduction and possibly having to do that in post while editing. Anyways, back to the video features of the camera. Up first, the A7 V can now record in 4K in almost full frame at up to 60 frames per second. Yes! What do you mean almost full frame, Matt? Well, in my testing, even though Sony told me it could record 4K 60 full frame, it actually looks like it has about a 1.15x crop. Not a huge crop, mind you, but it is noticeable when you're comparing a shot filmed in 4K 24 FPS next to a shot of 4K at 60 FPS. So it's a slight crop, but I will leave it up to you whether it's a deal breaker or not. It's kind of like using 120 FPS recording on the Sony a7S III or FX3 where it crops in just a little bit. Also, speaking of 120 FPS, I have more good news and bad news. We're going back and forth here. Good news, this camera is also capable of recording in 4K at 120 frames per second, which is great to see. Bad news. There's a 1.5x crop in 4K at 120. That is a bummer, but personally, as someone who does not use 4K at 120 FPS very often, I don't think that's a huge negative, and I'm extremely happy to see 4K at 60 FPS available with dramatically less crop that is almost full frame. In addition, just like with the A7 IV, this 4K at 60 FPS footage is oversampled from the 7K resolution sensor. So if you like the extra crispness of the footage that you would get from the A7 IV, the A7 V has that as well, but with the added bonus of also doing it in 4K 60 without that big crop. Hold up though, because you may remember from the A7 IV and FX2, the sensor in both of those cameras wasn't known for the best rolling shutter performance. It was pretty terrible actually, with a very slow sensor readout speed. Thankfully, between the much faster partially stacked sensor and the Bion's XR2 processor in the A7 V, this camera performs significantly better in the rolling shutter department. And as you can see, even shaking the camera back and forth, it looks much better. If you film handheld, this camera will work very well for you. Now, taken in a vacuum, these upgrades are great to see. The A7 V as an entry-level camera is clearly a great step up in quality over the A7 IV. But we as consumers don't live in a world where Sony is the only camera manufacturer. They have competition that has been doing some very cool and aggressive moves to keep up with and even surpass them. At the time of recording this video, Canon has recently released the R6 Mark III, a camera that doesn't just oversample 7K footage down to 4K, it is capable of actually recording 7K footage, and it can also be raw video, and it can also record in open gate where it uses the full width and height of the sensor. The A7 V can't do any of that. It's just limited to 4K at 120 FPS or 60 FPS if you want it in almost full frame. And so I think this is a really interesting experiment because the vibe that I'm getting is that Sony is taking a gamble here. And they're betting, at least with their entry-level, most well-rounded hybrid for photo and video full frame camera, the A7 V, that they are going to be able to give filmmakers and photographers enough of what they want to be happy while still holding back on some of these higher end pro level features like resolutions higher than 4K and open gate recording. Will people still buy this camera if it doesn't have those features? Are these people asking for internal raw video and open gate just a vocal minority? That is the gamble that Sony is making, and I am very interested in seeing how it plays out. Personally, I'm one of those pro filmmakers that has been asking for features like that, and I have found myself, for especially my YouTube videos, using Panasonic and their newer cameras far more often. Right now, I'm using the S1 II because I could record all of my videos in 6K, which makes it very easy to reframe them. Their cameras also support 32-bit float audio recording, which makes editing significantly easier because I never have to worry about the audio peaking. And for my overhead shot that I'm using to show products on my desk, like this camera, I'm also using Panasonic and filming in open gate, which makes it way easier to reframe the shot if I don't get the product directly under the camera where it belongs. So do you see what I'm saying? These are real features that I use every day. And so when Sony doesn't include them in their competing camera, it makes me less likely to want to buy it or recommend it. But I'm trying to make this review for everybody. And like I said earlier, if you are not someone who cares about these higher level features and you just want an extremely competent Sony camera that will film 4K at 60 FPS in almost full frame, I think you're going to be very happy with this camera. Now that said, there is one upgrade of the A7 V over all previous Sony Alpha cameras, and that is that Sony is now claiming up to 16 stops of dynamic range can be recorded in S-Log3. This is a big deal, considering that all previous modern Sony cameras like the A1 II, FX3, and original A7 IV were all claimed by Sony to have only 15 stops of dynamic range, with the Venice 2 and Burano being really the only cameras that they made that claimed had 16 stops. Whether this is due to the new partially stacked sensor or the enhanced image processor in the Bion's XR2, I'm not sure, but I'm always happy to welcome more dynamic range, meaning that this camera should have some of the best highlight retention and least noise in the shadows when filming with it. Of course, the real world dynamic range is never going to be as good as what Sony claims, but by them claiming a higher dynamic range, that should result in greater dynamic range overall compared to previous cameras. In all of my testing and filming with this camera, I can confirm the image looks very good with a lot of shadow and highlight detail retention. As far as high ISO performance goes, this is where things get really interesting because you may be considering this camera if you're using it to film a wedding or another event where you have to film in very dark conditions. I'm happy to tell you that just like the A7 IV, which excelled in low light, the same applies to the A7 V as well. And it is surprisingly getting close to the low light performance of the A7S III and FX3. Really? Yes, specifically the camera has a dual native ISO sensor like the A7 IV, with the first base ISO being at 800, and unlike the A7 IV, which only had the second base ISO at 3200, the second base ISO on the A7 V is ISO 8000 by my testing, which is very good. Keep in mind that the A7S III and FX3 are the low light kings, and they have a second base ISO of 12,800. So the A7 V is getting really close. For the A7 V in particular, I would feel comfortable going up to approximately ISO 25,600 as the maximum before more visible noise starts creeping into the shadows. But that said, if you want to denoise a bit in post, you should be able to basically go as high as you need to. This sensor is really great in low light. Moving on, but keeping on this resolution and quality trend, do you know what filming in 4K at 60 FPS and 120 FPS gives you? Not only great looking footage, but a lot of heat. And the A7 V does not have a fan. Just like with its predecessor, Sony's relying on passive cooling, but unlike its predecessor, I have good news. Sony is using the same passive cooling heatsink design from the A7S III, which works extremely well. And in my testing, it looks like the A7 V is going to be harder to make overheat than the A7 IV, which is great news. Unfortunately for you though, but fortunate for Sony, this camera was loaned to me in November, and Texas is no longer pushing over 100 degrees outside, so I'm not going to do a formal overheating test of this camera where I put it outside in the sun in the middle of August. Maybe we can revisit that next summer. But for now, what you need to know is that in all my testing and running around filming with this camera, I was never able to make it overheat. And in addition, Sony also gave me overheating performance numbers, which is not something that I can recall them ever doing before. But it tells me they are more confident about the overheating performance of the A7 V. Sony claims that they were able to record 4K at 60 FPS in a 68 degree Fahrenheit air-conditioned room for 90 minutes before the camera overheated, and more impressively, at a much hotter 105 degrees, this camera lasted for an hour. Does this mean you can film an outdoor wedding ceremony with it in the direct slide light in the summer? I'm not going to go as far as telling you can do that until I've had the chance to test it, but just know that if you're coming from an A7 IV, I would expect the overheating performance to be significantly improved over that camera, which is great news. And we have another upgrade to talk about. And while this is not a new feature for Sony cameras, it is new for the A7 V. And that is that this camera not only has improved IBIS that makes it better for filming handheld than its predecessor, it also has Sony's dynamic active stabilization mode, which will crop the sensor a significant amount, but will also make your footage much more stable in the process. So if you are someone who does not have a gimbal with them and you still want stable video, this is a feature that I think you're going to appreciate. Now, another way for Sony to be able to make this entire camera more efficient is that in previous Sony cameras, they were using a secondary chip called an AI processor that would work in tandem with the camera's main processor and enable it to have improved autofocus that used AI to be very fast. Well, I have good news. With the Bionz XR2, Sony has incorporated that AI processor into the main chip. So there's no need for the cameras to be running two separate processors. Everything is fully integrated into one chip, which significantly improves the overall efficiency and also means the A7 V has the much loved best autofocus that you can get from Sony. And all of my testing, it is extremely reliable and accurate. It is a joy to use this autofocus. I was talking to my friend and fellow YouTuber Sydney Deongson about this camera, and he called it a baby A1 II. And I think that's a very appropriate way to think about it. If the A1 II is Sony's best hybrid camera for photo and video, the A7 V is basically a baby version of that. Do you want many of the features of the A1 II but with an improved image processing chip and a dramatically cheaper price? Well, in that case, the A7 V may be the camera for you. It is a significant improvement over the A7 IV with many features that filmmakers wanted in that camera, like 4K 60 in full frame with much less of a crop, and 4K 120 FPS recording, and better low light performance. And I have to say that it is very puzzling that Sony released the FX2 earlier in 2025, because if they had just waited one more year to release it with this same sensor in the A7 V, I believe it would have been dramatically higher praised as a camera. Because Sony did this though, I would bet serious money that they're already working on an FX2 Mark II with an A7 IV sensor and hopefully other improved video capabilities as well. And those other improved video capabilities are really what I feel like are going to be the main focus of discussion when it comes to this camera. Yes, the A7 V is a very nice upgrade over the A7 IV, but Sony's competition has also caught up. In a similar price range, you have the Panasonic S1 II recording 6K at 60 FPS and 5K open gate, plus ProRes RAW and 32-bit float audio. Canon has the R6 Mark III and C50 recording 7K open gate in Canon RAW. Nikon gives you 6K recording with Red RAW, 32-bit float audio, and a much cheaper price of $2,200 bucks. Sony was ahead of everybody for so long, but with the A7 V, they're really now the ones that need to play catch up. They are taking a big gamble with this camera, betting that filmmakers, especially entry-level ones, are going to be happy with oversampled 4K at 60 and 120 FPS versus truly being able to record in 6K and 7K like their competition. Personally, I have felt less and less loyal to Sony in the past few years, and now I find myself using a Panasonic S1 II for most of my YouTube videos while saving my A7S III for vlogging and wedding films. I used to use Sony for everything, but the competition caught up. If nothing else, the Sony A7 V proves that Sony really needs to get the FX3 Mark II and A7S IV right. They need to surpass the competition again and leave them working to catch up for 5 years, including all the features that we as filmmakers have been asking for, like internal RAW recording and OpenGate and 32-bit float audio, while also surprising us with new features that we won't be able to live without. Regardless, I would love to hear you in the comments what you think of the A7 V. Would you buy this camera or something from the competition? I'll link to my Sony autofocus cheat sheet down in the video description that's going to help you get amazing autofocus with all of your Sony cameras. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you loved it. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.